Hey guys, tonight we've slipped back in time. Back to a place of scorching sun and long, cool shadows. You can feel the heat radiating from immense limestone blocks. Taste the dust of the Levant on your tongue. This is Jerusalem, nearly 1,000 years ago, and you are standing before a mystery cloaked in a white mantle, marked with a blood-red cross. We're delving into the story of the Knights Templar, but we're going far beyond the battles and the castles. We're chasing a whisper, a rumor of a secret so profound it could unravel history itself. It's a story of a hidden purpose, a legacy that might still be shaping our world from the shadows. Honestly, given the fate of those who got too close to the Templars' inner circle, you probably won't survive this. Metaphorically speaking, I hope. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You see them first as a flicker of white against the beige and ochre landscape of the Holy Land. At first, they are barely a footnote in the grand, bloody saga of the Crusades. They call themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. A mouthful, isn't it? It's the kind of name designed to project humility, a certain kind of pious grit. It's around the year 1119, just 2 decades after the First Crusade carved out a fragile Christian kingdom in a land sacred to 3 faiths. The roads are a nightmare. Pilgrims, emboldened by the capture of Jerusalem, are flocking to see the holy sites. But the journey from the coast at Jaffa to the holy city is a gauntlet of bandits and ambushes. The local lords are too busy squabbling over territory and titles to effectively police the routes. Into this vacuum step 2 French knights, Hugh de Payens and Godfrey de Saint-Omer. They approach Baldwin II, the king of Jerusalem, with a proposal. It's simple, direct, and seemingly selfless. They and a small handful of other knights, 7 others, for a total of 9, wish to form a monastic order. But instead of a life of cloistered prayer, they will take up the sword to protect the weary travelers making their way to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They will live as monks but fight as soldiers, dedicating their lives to this one dangerous, charitable task. King Baldwin, likely thinking it's a low-cost solution to a thorny problem, agrees. He grants them a headquarters, a space of immense symbolic power, a wing of the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount. This is a crucial detail. The Temple Mount is, for the Christians of the time, the site of the original Temple of Solomon. For them, the mosque is standing on sacred, historic ground. By quartering the new order there, Baldwin isn't just giving them a place to sleep. He's giving them a name. They are the Knights of the Temple, the Templars. He and the Patriarch of Jerusalem give them food and supplies from their own stores. The order is born from piety and pragmatism, or so the story goes. You watch them in your mind's eye. Those first 9, they don't look like the powerhouse they would become. They are poor, genuinely so. Their initial seal depicts 2 knights sharing a single horse, a potent symbol of their vow of poverty and their brotherly bond. They wear cast-off clothing, relying on donations to survive. They take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, the standard monastic package. But there's that 4th, unwritten vow in their actions, the vow of the sword. They are a paradox from the very beginning. Men of God sworn to peace, who practice the art of war. For the next 9 years, from 1119 to 1128, these 9 men are the entirety of the order. 9 knights to protect the teeming, dangerous roads of a kingdom. It feels thin, like a skeleton crew for a mission that would require hundreds. They patrol, they escort, but recruitment is strangely stagnant. The official histories are quiet on this period. It's a placeholder decade, a time of quiet commitment, we are told. But the silence itself is strange. An order founded on such a dramatic premise, in such a volatile place, and for 9 years, nothing much seems to happen. No great battles are recorded, no heroic last stands, no influx of new recruits rushing to join their righteous cause. They are just there. 9 men living on the most contested piece of real estate on the planet. And this is where the first crack appears in the pristine, official narrative. It's a crack that whispers of a different purpose. While they are supposedly patrolling the roads, they are also living directly on top of the ruins of Solomon's temple. And below that, the ruins of Herod's temple, a place of legend rumored to hold secrets and treasures beyond imagining. Whispers begin to circulate, not just in the marketplaces of Jerusalem, but in the courts of Europe. What are they really doing in that holy place? Are they guarding the roads, or are they digging in the stables? The so-called Solomon's stables were the vast subterranean vaults beneath the temple platform. For 9 years, the Templars had almost exclusive access to them. The idea that these knights, these devout and curious men, wouldn't have explored what lay beneath their own feet beggars belief. It's here that historians begin to diverge. The mainstream view is that their early years were simply a struggle for survival and recognition, that their small number reflected the difficulty of attracting members to such a dangerous and unproven vocation. But another school of thought, one that lurks in the footnotes and the more speculative histories, suggests that the pilgrimage protection was a cover, a brilliant one. It gave them a legitimate reason to be there, to carry arms, and to have the king's blessing. But their real mission, this theory suggests, was archaeological, or perhaps, more accurately, it was a treasure hunt. They were looking for something specific. In 1129, everything changes. Hugh de Payens travels to Europe to seek official sanction from the Pope. He attends the Council of Troyes in his home region of Champagne, France. Here, the order is not just recognized, it's championed. The key figure is Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman of his era. He is a Cistercian abbot, a mystic, a theologian, and a political powerhouse. He is also, incidentally, the nephew of one of the original 9 knights. Bernard writes a treatise in praise of the new knighthood, which is essentially the ultimate recruitment brochure. He contrasts the vain, sinful, secular knights of Europe with the noble, selfless Templars. He frames their violence not as sin, but as a righteous act, a concept he calls malicide, the killing of evil, not the killing of a man. This is a game changer. With the Pope's blessing and Bernard's powerful endorsement, the Knights Templar explode in popularity. Donations pour in. Land, castles, farms, money. A flood of recruits from the highest echelons of the nobility clamor to join. The order is given its rule, also crafted by Bernard. It dictates every aspect of their lives, from their prayers to their meals, to how they wear their beards. They are to wear a simple white mantle, a symbol of the purity they have sworn to protect, leaving behind the dark life of the world. Later, Pope Eugenius III will add the famous croix pate, a red cross with splayed arms, to be worn over their hearts. It is a symbol of their willingness to be martyred for the faith. In just a few years, they transform from a tiny, obscure band of brothers into a multinational corporation with a military wing. They are the Church's elite fighting force, answerable only to the Pope himself. This exemption from all local laws and taxes, granted by the papal bull Omne Datum Optimum in 1139, is what sets the stage for their incredible accumulation of power. They are a sovereign entity, a state within a state, with outposts called commanderies springing up all across Europe. But the question of those first 9 years still hangs in the air. If they went to Europe to get backing, it means their 9-year mission in Jerusalem was, in some sense, complete. Did they find what they were looking for? If it was just about getting official status, why wait 9 years? Why the specific number of 9 nights? The narrative feels constructed like a press release for a project whose real objectives are classified. Let's lean into the speculation just for a moment. Imagine you're not just a historian, but an investigator. You look at the evidence. 9 nights. 9 years. The Temple of Solomon. The powerful backing of Bernard of Clairvaux. The sudden, explosive growth. It doesn't add up to just pilgrim protection. It smells of a plan, a conspiracy in the truest sense of the word, a breathing together of a small group towards a shared, secret goal. What could they have found? The most common theories point to religious relics. The Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail, the scrolls and treasures of the Jewish temples sacked by the Romans in 70 AD. Finding any of these would have been a discovery of world-shaking importance. The Ark alone, the vessel said to contain the 10 Commandments, would be the most powerful relic in Christendom. Possessing it would grant the Templars unimaginable leverage over kings and popes alike. Perhaps this is the secret they guarded. Perhaps their vast network was built to protect not just pilgrims, but a physical object of immense power. This is a compelling theory. It fits many of the facts. But there is another layer to this, a theory far more dangerous, far more heretical. It posits that the treasure the Templars unearthed was not gold or a holy artifact. It was information. It was knowledge, a secret history that, if revealed, would not just shake the foundations of the Church, but shatter them completely. This is the central claim we are exploring tonight, the idea that the Knights Templar, in their excavations beneath the Temple Mount, discovered documents, perhaps Gospels that never made it into the New Testament, or genealogical records, or personal accounts from the dawn of Christianity, that told a different story. The story they uncovered, according to this theory, was that Jesus Christ was not the chaste, divine being portrayed by the orthodoxy of Rome. He was a man who married and who had a child. You have to understand the sheer explosive power of this idea in the 12th century. The entire structure of the Catholic Church, its authority, its celibate priesthood, its claim to be the sole intermediary between God and humanity through the succession of St. Peter, was built on the divinity of a celibate Christ. The idea of a married Jesus with a direct, physical bloodline would be the ultimate heresy. It suggests that Christ's legacy was not just spiritual, but physical. It implies a dynasty, a holy family whose descendants might still be alive. The theory identifies the wife of Jesus as Mary Magdalene. She is reframed not as a repentant prostitute, a story largely based on a conflation of several different women in the Gospels by Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century, but as a woman of high standing, possibly from a princely family herself, and the chosen partner of Jesus. After the crucifixion, with her life in danger, she is said to have fled Judea. She traveled with the child, a daughter, in most versions of the tale, named Sarah, and a small group of followers, including Joseph of Arimathea. And where did she go? She sailed across the Mediterranean and landed on the shores of what is now southern France. This region, the Languedoc, was a hotbed of heterodox beliefs for centuries. It was the heartland of the Cathars, a Gnostic Christian sect that the church would later brutally exterminate in a crusade. It was a place with deep, mystical traditions and a history of independence from both the French crown and the Roman pontiff. It is here, the story goes, that the bloodline of Christ took root in European soil. Mary Magdalene, the carrier of the Holy Grail, not a cup, but the vessel of the royal blood, planted a new vine. Her descendants, over the centuries, are said to have intermarried with the local nobility, their sacred secret passed down from generation to generation. Eventually, this bloodline is said to have merged with the rising power of the Franks, culminating in the Merovingian dynasty. The long-haired Merovingian kings, who ruled from the 5th to the 8th century, were always seen as having a mystical, semi-divine aura. Their legendary ancestor, Merovech, was said to have been born of two fathers, a mortal king and a sea creature, a quinator. Historians still argue whether the Merovingian kings cultivated this mystique themselves or if it was a genuine folk belief in their supernatural origins. This strange legend, proponents of the bloodline theory say, is a garbled memory of their sacred ancestry, a mythologized version of their descent from Christ. When the Merovingians were deposed by the Carolingians, with the full backing of the Pope, the bloodline was not extinguished. It was merely driven deeper underground, surviving in the shadows, waiting. According to the theory, one of the primary goals of certain European noble families, families that were patrons of the Cistercians and, later, the Templars, was to find and restore this lost lineage to its rightful place. Hugh de Payens himself was from one such family, a vassal of the Count of Champagne, who was a known patron of heretical and esoteric knowledge. So, the 9 knights go to Jerusalem. They aren't just 9 random, pious men. They are representatives of a powerful network of European nobility. Their mission, orchestrated by figures like the Count of Champagne and championed by the well-connected Bernard of Clairvaux, is to find the proof, the birth certificates, the marriage records, the genealogical scrolls, the proof of the bloodline that could be used as the ultimate political and religious weapon. For 9 years, they dig, and the story concludes, they find it. This is the secret the Templars carried. It's the reason for their existence. It's why they needed to become so powerful, so quickly. They weren't just guarding the roads. They were guarding the sang real, the royal blood. The French term Saint Grail, Holy Grail, is, in this interpretation, a corruption of sang real. It was never about a cup. The Grail, the vessel that held the blood of Christ, was the womb of Mary Magdalene and, by extension, the lineage she carried. It's a clever, poetic, and subversive rereading of the entire Arthurian legend cycle, which, not coincidentally, began to flourish in Europe at the exact same time the Templars were rising to prominence. Their vow of poverty becomes a public relations masterstroke. How could an order sworn to poverty be secretly plotting to overthrow the established order? It's a bit like a modern tech billionaire wearing the same hoodie every day. It's a performance of simplicity that masks immense, world-shaping power. Their international network of commanderies wasn't just for funneling money to the Crusader states. It was a web, a communication system, a clandestine state dedicated to protecting and nurturing the secret lineage. They became the guardians of the descendants of Christ, identifying them, protecting them, and perhaps even grooming them for an eventual return to power. This reframes everything about them. Their immense wealth, their pioneering of international banking, their military prowess, their fanatical devotion. It all snaps into focus if you see it through this lens. They weren't just serving the church. They were building a shadow church, based on a truth they believed to be more fundamental than the one preached from Rome. Their loyalty was not ultimately to the Pope in Rome, but to the hidden kings of their own secret faith. Think of the sheer audacity to operate for nearly 2 centuries, embedding themselves in the very fabric of Christendom, while holding a secret that amounted to theological treason. It's the kind of long-game strategy that makes most modern conspiracies look like child's play. Imagine the initiation ceremonies, the secret rites where this knowledge was passed down from one generation of Templar masters to the next. The symbols and rituals that seemed merely religious to the outside world would have held a second, deeper meaning for the inner circle. This, of course, is where we entered the territory of speculative history made popular by books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail. The central piece of evidence for this modern theory is a set of documents supposedly discovered in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris in the mid-20th century, which detailed the history of a secret society called the Priory of Sion. This priory was said to be the secret hand that created the Templars as their military and administrative arm. While the priory would continue in secret, the Templars would be their public face. The list of the priory's alleged Grand Masters is a who's who of European luminaries, including Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, and Victor Hugo. It's a fantastic, thrilling story. It's also, it must be said, widely considered by mainstream historians to be a hoax, a brilliant and elaborate mid-20th century fabrication. But even if the Priory of Sion documents are a fiction, it doesn't mean the underlying idea is baseless. Hoaxes often attach themselves to genuine, pre-existing mysteries. The idea of a sacred bloodline and the Templars as its guardians didn't just appear in the 1980s. Whispers of it, in different forms, have existed for centuries. The Gnostic Gospels, like the Gospel of Philip, which were rediscovered at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945, speak of Mary Magdalene as Jesus' companion and mention him kissing her often, which scandalized the other disciples. These are authentic ancient texts that show that in the early days of Christianity, the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene was viewed very differently, and far more intimately, than it is in the canonical New Testament. So you're left with a choice. You can see the Templars as they are presented in the history books, a pious, innovative, and ultimately tragic military order that grew too powerful for its own good and was brutally suppressed for its wealth. It's a clean, compelling story, or you can see them as something more. You can see the 9 knights on the Temple Mount not as humble servants, but as seekers. You can see their incredible rise to power not as a happy accident of history, but as the deliberate execution of a master plan. You can see their white mantles not just as a symbol of purity, but as a disguise, hiding a truth so potent it had to be buried under layers of ritual, wealth, and stone. The central claim, then, is this: the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon were, from their inception, the guardians of the greatest secret in the Western world, the continuation of Christ's own family on earth. Their true purpose was not to defend a patch of land in the Middle East, but to protect a living, breathing bloodline, a dynasty with a claim to rule that was, in their eyes, more divine than that of any king, emperor, or pope. It's a claim that turns them from martyrs of the church into its most profound rivals. And if this lineage did survive, protected by the Templars' immense and clandestine network, then the next question is obvious. Where did it go? And where is it now? Their story doesn't end with their fiery demise in the 14th century. In fact, that's just where the trail goes cold, and the hunt truly begins. We have to assume that if they were guarding something so precious, they would have had a contingency plan, a plan to ensure that the kind of machine you would need to guard a secret like a holy bloodline couldn't be a simple fortress of stone and steel. It would have to be a fortress of influence, of wealth, of information. It would need to be everywhere and nowhere, with tendrils reaching into every royal court and every merchant's ledger from the windswept coast of Scotland to the sun-baked ports of Italy. It would need, in short, to become exactly what the Knights Templar became in the 2 centuries after they left their supposed excavations on the Temple Mount. The contingency plan wasn't just a map with an X on it. It was the network itself. And that network was built on a foundation of unimaginable wealth. It all started as a trickle and became a deluge after the Council of Troyes in 1129, when the most famous churchman in Europe, Bernard of Clairvaux, essentially gave the Templars his divine seal of approval. The doors to the treasuries of Christendom blew open. Remember, this was an age of profound faith and equally profound anxiety about the afterlife. The nobility of Europe, who lived by the sword, were constantly worried about the state of their souls. Bernard offered them a perfect solution: support the Templars. By giving a part of your worldly wealth to these holy warriors, you are directly investing in the defense of Christendom. It was a spiritual loophole, a way to gain favor with God while remaining a feudal lord with all the violent earthly business that entailed. And so, the donations began. A pious widow in Provence would bequeath her small vineyard. A powerful duke in England would grant them a vast tract of forest. A Spanish count on the front lines of the Reconquista would give them a castle he had just captured from the Moors. It wasn't just cash. It was land, farms, mills, fishing rights, villages, churches, and the right to collect taxes from them all. Within 50 years, the Templars were one of the largest landowners in the Western world. Thousands of properties, which they organized into a brilliant administrative system of local commanderies, all reporting upwards to a regional master, and ultimately to the Grand Master of the Order. Each commandery was a hub of activity. It was part monastery, part farm, part military barracks, and part administrative center, while a handful of knights and sergeants would live there, bound by the strict monastic rule. The bulk of the work was done by lay workers, tenant farmers, and specialized managers who ran these estates with remarkable efficiency. They were pioneers of agriculture and animal husbandry. They turned forests into productive farmland and swamps into grazing pastures. All the profits, every last florin, ducat, and livre, flowed into the order's central coffers, tax-free. Here you must admire the sheer genius of their central vow, the vow of poverty. It was the linchpin of their entire economic model. You, as an individual Knight Templar, owned nothing. Not the armor on your back, not the horse you rode, not the tunic you wore. You were given 3 horses, a squire, and the necessary equipment, but it was all the property of the order. You ate in a communal refectory, slept in a communal dormitory. You were forbidden from having personal possessions or even a locked chest. This intense, personal poverty created an image of unimpeachable piety. But the order itself, the order could be, and was, staggeringly rich. It was the most elegant piece of creative accounting in the Middle Ages, a perfect separation of personal vow and corporate reality. They were the world's first and most successful nonprofit, at least on paper. This accumulation of land and agricultural wealth was impressive, but it was what they did next that truly changed the world and cemented their power. They didn't just hoard their assets, they made them liquid. They invented international banking. To understand how revolutionary this was, you have to place yourself in the mind of a 13th century nobleman. Let's say you are Sir Reginald of Surrey, and you've decided to go on crusade, or perhaps a pilgrimage, to the Holy Land. It's a journey of thousands of miles, taking many months. How do you pay for it? You can't exactly carry a chest full of silver coins with you. It's absurdly heavy, for one. And for another, you'd be painting a giant target on your back for every bandit, pirate, and unscrupulous innkeeper between England and Jerusalem. The roads were dangerous, and moving wealth was the riskiest proposition of all. This is the problem the Templars solved. With their network of secure, fortified commanderies all over Europe and the Holy Land, they were uniquely positioned to act as a financial conduit. So, you, Sir Reginald, would go to the new temple, the Templar headquarters in London. It was a huge, circular church with a sprawling complex of buildings around it, a fortress in the heart of the city. You would meet with the Templar treasurer and deposit your funds, let's say 100 marks of silver. In return, you would be given not a bag of coins, but a piece of parchment, a letter of credit. This letter was the key. It was written in a complex cipher known only to the order's treasurers. It would detail the amount you deposited in London. You would then tuck this small, lightweight, and seemingly worthless piece of parchment into your tunic and begin your journey. You could travel light and fast, with no treasure to guard. Months later, when you finally arrive, dusty and exhausted, in the port city of Acre in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, you would find the local Templar commandery. You would present your letter of credit. The Templar treasurer there would verify the cipher, perhaps ask for a password you were given in London, and then, from their own vaults, he would give you 100 marks of silver in the local currency. They would take a small, reasonable fee for the service, of course. You have just witnessed a miracle of medieval finance. You have teleported your wealth across the known world, safely and securely. This system of promissory notes was the forerunner of the modern checking account, the traveler's check, and the wire transfer. It was an idea so powerful, so useful, that it made the Templars indispensable. They weren't just for pilgrims. Kings used them to transfer funds to their armies. Merchants used them to settle debts across the continent. The papacy itself used the Templar network as its personal bank to move the vast revenues of the church from places like England and Germany all the way back to Rome. They became the trusted financial institution for all of Christendom. The Paris Temple, a massive fortress on the outskirts of the city, effectively became the royal treasury of France. When the king needed to collect taxes or manage the kingdom's finances, it was the Templar accountants he relied on. When English kings needed a safe place to store the crown jewels, they were often lodged at the London Temple. The Templars became masters of finance. They offered loans, managed estates for absentee lords, executed wills, and acted as financial advisors to the most powerful people in the world. They were a medieval blend of the Federal Reserve, Goldman Sachs, and a heavily armed Brinks security team. And if their true purpose was to guard a secret, this was the perfect cover. Who would suspect that the sober, meticulous accountants balancing the books of kings were also the guardians of a hidden dynasty? Their power was hidden in plain sight, buried in the columns of a ledger. This immense financial power inevitably bled into the political sphere. It's a simple rule of history. When you are the one lending the money, you get a seat at the table. Kings and princes were constantly short on cash. Crusades, wars, building projects. These things were fantastically expensive. And the Templars were always there, ready to provide a loan. King Louis VII of France borrowed heavily from them to finance the Second Crusade. King Henry II of England used the Templars as his personal bankers and financial agents. His son, the famous Richard the Lionheart, was a close ally of the order. When he was captured and held for ransom on his way back from the Third Crusade, it was the Templars who helped manage the collection and transfer of the immense sum required for his release. They weren't just lenders, they were diplomats and advisors. Because they were a multinational order, with members from every noble family in Europe, they had an unparalleled network of contacts. And because they were answerable only to the Pope, they were seen as being above petty national rivalries. A Templar knight could travel freely between England and France, even when the two kingdoms were at war. This made them ideal envoys, neutral arbiters in disputes between monarchs. They could broker treaties, mediate conflicts, and carry sensitive messages, all under the protection of their white mantle. It's hard to overstate how unique this position was in the fragmented world of medieval Europe. They were the closest thing the era had to a United Nations, but with its own army and its own bank. Historians still argue whether the Templars' political influence was a deliberate pursuit of power or simply an unavoidable byproduct of their immense financial acumen. Did they consciously seek to control kings from behind the scenes? Or were they just very, very good at their jobs, with political entanglement as the natural result? If you believe the bloodline theory, the answer is obvious. The political influence was the entire point. They needed to be in the throne rooms and the council chambers. They needed to know what the kings were planning. They needed to steer events, to protect certain families, to subtly influence the course of European politics, to safeguard the seigneurial. Their role as bankers was the key that unlocked the door to power. It's a bit awkward to argue with the man who holds your mortgage, especially when he's also a member of an elite international military force that answers only to the Pope. It tends to make you listen to his advice very carefully. And they did have their own military force, not just in the East, but everywhere. Each major commandery had a garrison of knights and sergeants. They were a standing army, disciplined, trained, and loyal to the order above all else. In an age when a king had to beg his vassals to raise an army for a campaign, the Templars had a permanent, professional force at their command. This gave them a hard power that backed up their soft power of finance and diplomacy. They were a formidable entity, and everyone knew it. There's also the matter of their fleet. This is a somewhat fringe tidbit, but a fascinating one. The Templars maintained their own fleet of ships, with their main Atlantic port at La Rochelle in France. Officially, this fleet was for transporting men, horses, and supplies for the Crusades. But it also engaged in extensive commercial trade. They shipped wine from their vineyards in France, wool from their farms in England. They were a major player in international commerce. This fleet gave them an independence of movement that was unparalleled. They didn't need to ask a king for a ship. They had their own. And some theories, which we will explore later, suggest that this fleet was their ultimate escape plan, the key to disappearing with their treasure and their secret when the end came. You can imagine the whispers this kind of power generated. The secrecy of the order didn't help. Their initiation ceremonies were conducted in private, at night, in locked chapels. No one outside the order was permitted to witness them. While the reality was likely a series of pious oaths and rituals, the secrecy was a breeding ground for suspicion. What were they doing in there? The human imagination tends to fill vacuums with the most lurid possibilities. Rumors started to fly that they spat on the cross during their initiations, that they denied Christ, that they worshipped a severed head named Baphomet. These were almost certainly slanderous lies. But in a world without mass media, rumor and reputation were everything. It's like a medieval version of wild conspiracy theories spreading on social media. Once the rumor is out there, the truth barely matters. By the late 13th century, the tide was beginning to turn against them. Their initial purpose, the defense of the Holy Land, was becoming a lost cause. The last Crusader stronghold, Acre, fell in 1291. The Templars fought heroically to the last, their Grand Master being gravely wounded, but it was over. The Crusader states were gone. This left the Templars in a precarious position. They were a hugely powerful and wealthy military order with no war to fight. Their original raison d'etre had evaporated. They were still the bankers and advisors of Europe, of course. But without the justifying cause of the Holy War, their existence started to look suspicious. Why does this religious order need so much money? Why do they have so many castles all over Europe? Why are they answerable to no one? Their power, once seen as a righteous tool for God's work, was now increasingly seen as a threat. Their reputation for arrogance, whether deserved or not, grew. They were seen as being a state within a state, a secret society with its own laws and its own agenda. And if you believe the bloodline theory, that's exactly what they were. Their success had become their greatest liability. They had built the perfect machine to protect a secret that could overturn the world. A machine of finance, of political influence, of military might, and of impenetrable secrecy. They had commanderies in every corner of the kingdom, a fleet to sail the seas, and the ear of every king. They had become so powerful, so self-contained, so untouchable, that they believed they were safe. They had forged a shield to protect the sacred lineage, but that same shield that made them strong also made them a target. It isolated them and bred a fatal mixture of fear and jealousy in the hearts of their rivals. And as the 13th century bled into the 14th, they were about to discover that they had a rival more powerful, more ruthless, and more desperate than any they had ever faced before. A king who saw their wealth not as a tool for God, but as a solution to his own bankruptcy. A king who saw their secrecy not as a sign of piety, but as a confession of heresy. They had built their fortress of power to last for 1,000 years, but its walls were about to be tested, and they would not hold. Boniface died a few weeks later, likely from the shock and humiliation. The world was stunned. The fortress of wealth and influence you so carefully constructed is formidable, but it has a flaw. Its power is abstract, spread across a continent in ledgers and land deeds and political favors. It is a power that relies on the established rules of society, on the sanctity of papal authority and the honor of kings. But now, you are about to face a new kind of power, a power that is centralized, absolute, and pathologically ambitious. You are about to meet King Philip IV of France, and he does not play by the rules. They called him Philippe le Bel, Philip the Fair. The name referred to his handsome, impassive features, not his character. Philip was a man of cold, quiet piety and terrifying resolve. He believed he was God's chosen instrument to forge France into a single, unified, and all-powerful Christian kingdom, with himself as its absolute monarch. He saw any power that was not his own, be it that of feudal lords, foreign kings, or even the Pope himself, as an obstacle to God's plan, an obstacle to be removed with surgical, remorseless precision. And Philip had a problem, a very modern problem, in fact. His kingdom was broke. Decades of war against the English and the Flemish had bled the royal treasury dry. To raise funds, he had already resorted to tactics that were shocking for the time. He had repeatedly debased the kingdom's currency, creating economic chaos but giving him a short-term infusion of cash. In 1306, he had arrested all the Jews in France, seizing their property and assets before expelling them from the kingdom. Shortly after, he did the same to the Lombard bankers, the Italian financiers who had picked up the slack. Philip was systematically looting his own kingdom to stay afloat, and he was running out of victims, except for one. From the windows of his Louvre palace, he could see the imposing walls of the Paris Temple. He knew better than anyone the sheer scale of the Templars' wealth, because their headquarters served as his own treasury. It was a daily, galling reminder of a vast fortune that was not his. He saw a treasure chest to which he did not have the key. The Templars, with their papal protection, their tax-exempt status, and their sovereign attitude, were an affront to his vision of absolute monarchy. They were a state within his state, a bank he couldn't control, and a source of wealth he desperately needed. To a man like Philip, this was an intolerable situation. The Templars had to go. He had already proven he had no fear of the church. He had engaged in a bitter power struggle with Pope Boniface VIII over the right to tax the clergy. The conflict escalated until Philip, through his thuggish chief minister Guillaume de Nogaret, had agents storm the papal palace in Anagni and physically assault the elderly pope. Boniface died a few weeks later, likely from the shock and humiliation. The world was stunned. A secular king had laid hands on the Vicar of Christ himself. After a brief interregnum, a new pope was elected, Clement V, a Frenchman. Philip leaned on the new pope heavily, eventually persuading him to move the entire papal court from Rome to Avignon, in what is now southern France. The papacy was now, for all intents and purposes, a captive of the French crown. The one shield the Templars had, the protection of a free and independent pope, was gone. Clement was Philip's man. The board was set. The plot was hatched in the deepest secrecy. Philip and Nogaret knew they couldn't just accuse the Templars of being too rich or too powerful. That would look like what it was, a simple smash and grab. They needed a justification so shocking, so vile, that it would not only excuse their actions but make them seem necessary, even righteous. They needed to destroy the Templars' reputation so completely that no one would dare to defend them. So they began to build a case, not of greed, but of monstrous heresy. They found a few disgruntled ex-Templars, men who had been expelled from the order for theft or insubordination, and they persuaded them to talk. These informants, likely coached and bribed by royal agents, began to spin lurid tales of what happened behind the locked doors of the Templar initiation ceremonies. The charges they compiled were a masterwork of propaganda, a greatest hits of medieval taboos. The Templars, they claimed, were forced to deny Jesus Christ and spit, trample, or urinate on a crucifix upon their entry into the order. They were instructed to worship an idol, a mysterious bearded head which the inquisitors would later call Baphomet. And they were forced to engage in homosexual acts, with the osculum infame, or kiss of shame, being part of the ritual. The charges read like a fever dream of depravity, carefully designed to horrify the common person and turn public opinion Tokshishna against the knights. It was a smear campaign of breathtaking audacity. With the puppet Pope Clement secured and the list of charges prepared, Philip and Nogaret planned the operation. It would be a lightning strike, coordinated across the entire kingdom to prevent any Templars from being warned and escaping. In the late summer of 1307, secret sealed orders were dispatched to the king's seneschals and bailiffs in every district of France. The letters contained the list of charges and a direct command from the king to arrest every single Templar within their jurisdiction, from the highest commander to the lowliest serving brother, and to seize all of the order's property. But there was a catch. These orders were not to be opened until a very specific date. They were to remain sealed until dawn on Friday, the 13th of October. Now, you are there. You're not a great knight or a commander. You're a sergeant, a brother of the order, living in a small commandery in the rolling hills of Burgundy. It's a quiet life. The rhythm of your days is marked by prayer, training in the yard, and overseeing the work on the commandery's farms. It is early morning, still dark, the air carrying the first cold bite of autumn. You are roused from sleep not by the bell for matins, the pre-dawn prayer, but by a splintering crash. The main gate of the commandery, which has stood open in peace for a century, has been smashed in. You grab a sword, your mind numb with confusion. This is France, not the Holy Land. There are no enemies here. You stumble out into the main courtyard to a scene of chaos. Royal soldiers, men wearing the king's livery, are everywhere, their torches casting frantic, dancing shadows on the stone walls. They are armed and armored for battle. Your commander is shouting, demanding an explanation, but he is surrounded, disarmed, and bound before he can finish his sentence. There is no fight. You are told you are being arrested on the orders of the king and the pope. The pope? It makes no sense. You are the pope's men. You try to protest, to ask what the charges are, but you are simply clubbed to the ground, your hands tied roughly behind your back, and dragged out into the cold morning. You look back at your home, the commandery, as you are herded together with your brothers. You see the king's men already carrying out chests, rounding up the livestock, taking inventory. In less than an hour, Your entire world has been turned upside down. This same scene is repeated with terrifying efficiency all across the Kingdom of France at the exact same moment. In Paris, the Grand Master himself, Jacques de Molay, is taken completely by surprise. He had only recently returned to France from Cyprus to discuss plans for a new crusade with the Pope. He had been an honored guest at the royal court, serving as a pallbearer at the funeral of the king's sister-in-law just the day before. On the morning of Friday the 13th, he is arrested and thrown into a dungeon. The sheer speed and coordination of the operation is breathtaking. Thousands of Templars, men who were part of the most formidable military organization in the world, are captured in a single morning, most of them without a single sword being drawn in their defense. The superstition about Friday the 13th being an unlucky day has many roots, but for many, its dark reputation was sealed in the collective consciousness by this single, brutal event. The hammer of the king had fallen. What came next was even worse. The arrested knights were not treated as prisoners of war, but as heretics. Philip kept them in his own dungeons, under the control of his own royal inquisitors. And the inquisitors got to work, employing the full, horrific arsenal of medieval torture. The knights were starved, beaten, their feet roasted over fires, their joints dislocated on the rack. The goal was not to discover the truth, but to force them to confess to the script of lies that Philip and Nogert had already written. And under this unimaginable agony, they broke. Of course, they broke. Human beings can only endure so much pain. One by one, knights who had faced down charging Mamluk cavalry in the desert without flinching were reduced to weeping, broken men willing to say anything, to confess to anything, just to make the pain stop. They confessed to spitting on the cross. They confessed to worshiping a cat, or a head, or the devil. They confessed to everything they were accused of. The most prized confession was that of the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay himself. After weeks of torment and pressure, he, too, confessed to some of the charges, a devastating blow to the order's morale. Philip now had what he needed, a mountain of sworn confessions, signed by the Templars themselves, that proved their guilt. Pope Clement V was, at least initially, horrified. This was his own special order, arrested and tortured without his direct command. He tried to intervene, suspending the authority of Philip's inquisitors and declaring that the trials would be run by the church. It seemed for a moment that the tide might turn. The Pope convened his own hearings, and here, away from the king's torturers, a remarkable thing happened. Hundreds of the knights, including Jacques de Molay, found their courage again. They publicly and bravely recanted their confessions, stating that they had lied under torture and that the order was innocent of all charges. They affirmed their Catholic faith and loyalty. Philip's response was swift and barbaric. He declared the knights who had recanted their confessions to be relapsed heretics, a crime for which the punishment was death. In May 1310, on Philip's direct orders, 54 Templars were taken to a field outside Paris, tied to stakes, and slowly burned to death. It was a public, horrific spectacle designed to send one clear message to the remaining Templars. If you recant, you will burn. It worked. The retraction stopped. The Pope, a weak and vacillating man, found himself completely outmaneuvered. Historians still argue whether Pope Clement V was a willing accomplice in Philip's scheme from the beginning, or a weak and intimidated figurehead forced to go along with a plot he couldn't control. Either way, the outcome was the same. He was powerless to stop the king. The public confessions obtained under torture were now the official record, and any attempt to deny them was met with fire. It's a grim reminder that a confession is only as reliable as the methods used to get it. Turns out, if you're creative enough with hot irons and strappado, you can get a man to admit he's the king of Mars. Finally, at the Council of Vienne in 1312, under immense pressure from King Philip, who had marched his army to the gates of the city, Pope Clement officially dissolved the Order of the Knights Templar. He did not declare them guilty of heresy, a subtle but important distinction, but dissolved them on the grounds that their reputation had been too gravely damaged for them to continue. It was a legalistic sidestep, a way to appease the king without fully endorsing his brutal methods. The Templars, as an institution, ceased to exist. Their lands and properties were ordered to be transferred to their rivals, the Knights Hospitaller, though King Philip managed to keep a huge portion of their French assets to cover the costs of the trial, a final, cynical act of theft. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, would languish in prison for 7 more years before being brought out onto a scaffold on an island in the Seine, in the shadow of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, to repeat his confession one last time. Instead, he once again recanted, proclaiming his innocence and that of the order. A furious King Philip ordered him burned at the same spot that very evening. But amidst all this destruction and death, a central mystery remained. Philip had the men, he had the land, but he didn't get the money. The legendary treasure of the Templars, the vast hoard of gold and silver from their banking empire, the liquid assets that were the entire motivation for the king's bloody enterprise, was gone. When royal officials stormed the Paris temple, they found the ledgers and the land deeds, but the vaults were conspicuously empty of the immense portable wealth they expected to find. It had vanished, and what of their fleet? The Templar ships docked at the Atlantic port of La Rochelle, one of the few major ports outside of the king's direct control, were also gone. According to persistent legend, on the nights just before the mass arrests, a number of wagons were seen leaving the Paris temple under cover of darkness. Did they carry the treasure? And did they rendezvous with the Templar fleet, which then slipped its moorings and sailed out into the fog of the Atlantic, carrying the last loyal knights, their treasure, and their most precious secret far beyond the reach of the grasping king? Philip had won, but his victory was hollow. He had destroyed the body of the order in France, but its heart, its wealth, its secret, and its most dedicated guardians had seemingly escaped. He was left with a pile of ashes, coerced confessions, and empty vaults. The true mission of the Templars, if you believe it was more than just banking and fighting, had not been buried in the dungeons of the Inquisition. It had been given a head start, and now, as the smoke cleared over Paris, the real question emerged: where did they go? King Philip the Fair sits in his palace, surrounded by the spoils of his victory. He has broken the most powerful order in Christendom. He has humbled the Pope and demonstrated the absolute authority of the French crown. Templar lands are now his to control and redistribute. Templar castles now fly his banner. He has the confessions, the recantations, the ashes of the Grand Master. He has everything, except the one thing he actually wanted. The money is gone. Imagine the fury, the sheer teeth-grinding frustration Royal officials, armed with the full authority of the king, tore the Paris temple apart. They broke down walls, pried up floorboards, dug up the cellars. They did the same in commanderies across the realm. They found weapons, armor, land deeds, livestock, furniture, and the complex ledgers detailing the order's immense assets. But the vast, liquid wealth, the tons of gold and silver coin, the jewels, the portable riches that formed the core of Europe's banking system, had vanished. It was as if the very concept of money had evaporated from the Templar vaults just moments before the king's men arrived. This is not a small discrepancy. We're not talking about a few misplaced chests of silver. This was the central reserve of a financial institution that dwarfed any kingdom. For it to simply disappear overnight points to something far more sophisticated than a few knights hastily burying treasure in a forest. It implies a plan, a contingency, executed with the same discipline and efficiency that had defined the Templars for 2 centuries. The tales of wagons leaving the temple in the dead of night, the mystery of the Templar fleet at La Rochelle sailing off into the Atlantic mist. These aren't just romantic legends. They are attempts to explain an event that, on its face, seems impossible. A disappearance so total, so audacious, that it has baffled historians for 700 years. But this is where we have to ask ourselves a fundamental question. What if we and King Philip have been looking for the wrong treasure all along? We've been captivated by the vision of pirate chests overflowing with gold coins and glittering jewels. It's a compelling image, but it's a material one. What if the real treasure of the Knights Templar was never something you could weigh or count? What if the gold was just a tool, a means to an end, and the true treasure was something far more valuable and far more dangerous? Let's go back to the central premise, the secret you uncovered in Section 1. The secret unearthed from beneath the Temple of Solomon. The secret of the Sangreal, the royal blood. The proof, whether in the form of scrolls, gospels, or genealogical records, that Jesus Christ had a child, and that his bloodline continued, hidden within the noble families of Europe. Now, place that secret on a scale. On one side, you have all the gold in Philip's empty vaults. On the other, you have a single piece of parchment that proves the existence of a sacred dynasty. A truth that invalidates the authority of the papacy and rewrites the history of the Western world. Which one is heavier? Which one is the real treasure? The gold doesn't even come close. The gold was the firewall. It was the budget. It was the funding that allowed the Templars to build their international network, to gain political influence, to raise armies, to become untouchable. It was all part of the elaborate, centuries-long project of protecting the real treasure, the secret and the people who embodied it. When the firewall was about to be breached, when King Philip was about to smash through their defenses, what would their priority be? Would they try to save the firewall? Or would they save the precious thing it was built to protect? They did the only logical thing. They sacrificed the infrastructure to save the mission. Seen through this lens, the disappearance of the gold is no longer a mystery. It's a strategic withdrawal. They didn't take all of it. That would have been impossible. They took what they needed. The wagons that rumbled out of Paris that night carried the seed capital for the next phase of the operation. It was the getaway fund, the startup money for Templarism 2.0. Enough to fund their journey into the shadows, enough to establish a new base of operations, and enough to sustain their guardianship for generations to come. They took the most critical assets, The proof, the relics, perhaps even a key member or family of the bloodline itself, loaded them onto their private fleet and vanished from the world stage. Remember, the crackdown on Friday the 13th was a uniquely French phenomenon in its speed and brutality. While Philip was torturing knights and seizing property, Templars in other kingdoms had time. In England, King Edward II was initially reluctant to move against them. In Spain and Portugal, where the Templars were revered as heroes of the Reconquista against the Moors, kings defended them. In Germany, Templar commanders showed up to their trials in full armor, flanked by their knights, and were promptly acquitted. This is a crucial historical fact. The order was not decapitated in a single blow. Thousands of Templars outside of France were perfectly safe and had months, even years, to organize, to hide assets, and to receive their brothers who were fleeing from Philip's persecution. The network was damaged, but it was far from destroyed. There were plenty of safe harbors where the ships from La Rochelle could have gone, plenty of loyal brothers waiting to carry on the work. So the mission was not about gold, nor was it about the common relics of Christendom. The search for the Holy Grail, as we traditionally think of it, a physical cup, is a misdirection. The Templars' secret was far more profound. They were guarding a body of knowledge, an entire alternative stream of spirituality that the Orthodox Church had spent centuries trying to stamp out. They were, in essence, Gnostics. Gnosticism was a major competitor to Pauline Christianity in the first few centuries after Christ. The core idea of the Gnostics was that salvation came not from blind faith or the rituals of a church, but from gnosis, direct, personal, experiential knowledge of the divine. They believed the material world was a flawed, corrupt creation, not of the true, transcendent God, but of a lesser, arrogant entity called the demiurge. This demiurge was often identified with the wrathful, jealous God of the Old Testament. The true God was beyond this world, and Christ was an emissary from that higher realm, sent to bring the light of Gnosis to the sparks of divinity trapped within certain human beings. This is, of course, profound heresy from the perspective of Rome. It reframes the entire Christian story. It also placed a high value on the divine feminine, often in the form of Sophia, or wisdom, who was seen as a key divine emanation. This is where the fringe but fascinating interpretation of the Baphomet charge comes in. The Inquisitors accused the Templars of worshipping a demonic head, but some esoteric traditions have proposed that Baphomet was not a name, but a code. When written in the Atbash cipher, the Hebrew substitution cipher, it becomes the Greek word Sophia. Others suggest it was a corruption of the Arabic Abu Fihmat, meaning father of understanding, or a portmanteau of the Greek words Baith and Madi, meaning a baptism of wisdom. In this light, the bearded head wasn't a demon idol. It was a symbol of the secret wisdom, the Gnosis, they protected. The Templars were not devil worshippers. They were guardians of a suppressed spiritual path. The bloodline fits perfectly into this Gnostic framework. The sacred lineage of Jesus and Mary Magdalene would be the hereditary keepers of this pure, uncorrupted knowledge. They were not just a dynasty with a claim to a throne. They were the living vessels of the original Gnosis, passed down from one generation to the next. A truth the institutional church sought to erase. Their deeper mission was to guard this flame of knowledge until a time when the world was ready for it. Scholars still debate the extent of esoteric or Gnostic influences within the Templar order, with some seeing them as strictly orthodox knights caught in a political power play, and others pointing to the suspicious symbolism, the intense secrecy of their rituals, and the very nature of the charges against them as evidence of a hidden, alternative doctrine. If you accept this premise, then the events of 1307 are not an ending. They are a transformation. It's the greatest corporate rebranding in history. The public-facing entity, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, Inc., with its vast real estate holdings and banking divisions, was dissolved. But the core project, the secret guardianship of the Sangreal and its associated Gnostic wisdom, simply went private. It shed its public skin and reverted to its original form, a true secret society operating from the shadows. Imagine the shock for some of those knights, used to the wealth and prestige of the order, going from managing Europe's finances to suddenly having to lie low in a Scottish fishing village, trying to blend in. It would have been a rather stark change in lifestyle. Remember when we used to advise the King of England? Well, today your job is to learn how to properly salt a herring so no one asks questions. The disappearance of the fleet was not an escape. It was a redeployment. The mission was not abandoned. It was preserved. They took the real treasure, the knowledge, the proof, and the people, and sailed off the edge of the known map, funded by enough untraceable wealth to ensure their work could continue for centuries. King Philip was left with empty buildings and a Pyrrhic victory, forever chasing a treasure he fundamentally misunderstood. He thought he was robbing a bank, when in fact he had merely forced a secret government into exile. So, the question that hangs in the air, heavy as the smoke from Jacques de Molay's pyre, is no longer if they survived, but where they survived. Where would you go if you were a fugitive brotherhood, hunted by the most powerful king in Europe and abandoned by the Pope? You would need a sanctuary, a place beyond the reach of French influence and papal decrees, a place whose own king had reasons to defy both Rome and its allies, a place with a rugged, defensible geography and a history of welcoming exiles and rebels, a place that was, at that very moment, locked in a desperate war of independence against a king who happened to be Philip's closest ally. You would set your sails for the one kingdom in Europe that would have every reason to welcome you with open arms, the wild, defiant, and excommunicated Kingdom of Scotland. We are now sailing into the heart of the mystery. We've established the Templars' secret mission and witnessed their dramatic, fiery transformation from a public power into a clandestine one. We've seen them spirit away their treasure from under the nose of the most powerful king in Europe. But to truly understand the stakes, to grasp the sheer gravity of what they were protecting, we need to zoom in on the most potent and misunderstood symbol in their entire story, the Holy Grail. When you hear the words, Holy Grail, a very specific image likely springs to your mind. It's the cup from the Last Supper, maybe a simple wooden chalice, maybe a golden, jewel-encrusted goblet. It's the sacred vessel that Joseph of Arimathea used to catch the blood of Christ as he hung on the cross. It is the ultimate Christian relic, an object of immense mystical power, capable of granting eternal youth, healing the sick, and revealing the beatific vision to the pure of heart. It's the object of King Arthur's and his knights' epic, tragic quest. This is the story we all know. But what if this story, the one that has echoed through our culture for centuries, is a smokescreen? What if it's a beautiful, allegorical lie designed to hide a truth that is far more literal and far more revolutionary. The first clue that something is amiss is the Grail's strange literary appearance. You will not find a single mention of the Holy Grail in the Bible. Not one, for a relic of such supposed importance. The foundational text of Christianity is completely silent on the matter. The story of Joseph of Arimathea catching Christ's blood in a cup is a later invention. The Grail emerges, seemingly out of nowhere, in the Romantic literature of the late 12th century. The first major writer to introduce it is the French poet Chrétien de Troyes, in his final, unfinished work, Percival, the Story of the Grail, written around 1180. And here's the fascinating part. In Chrétien's original telling, the Grail is not even a cup. He describes it as un graal, a wide, deep platter or serving dish of the kind used to serve fish at a banquet. It contains a single communion wafer, which is enough to miraculously sustain the life of the wounded fisher king. It is holy, it is mysterious, but it is not the cup of the Last Supper. That specific identification was made by later writers, most notably Robert de Boron, who explicitly connected the Grail to the vessel of the Last Supper and the crucifixion, cementing the image we have today. Think about the timing of this. The Grail romances explode across European culture, capturing the imagination of the nobility, at the exact historical moment that the Knights Templar are at the absolute zenith of their power and influence. Is this a coincidence? Or were the Templars, or the Cistercian monks who were their spiritual architects, deliberately seeding a new mythology into European consciousness? Were they trying to tell a secret story through the popular medium of chivalric romance? The theory we are exploring tonight argues that this is precisely what was happening. They were telling the world about their secret mission, but they were doing it in code. The key to unlocking this code is a simple, yet profound, linguistic twist. It is the key that turns the entire legend inside out. In Old French, the language of the original romances, the term for the Holy Grail is Saint-Grail. 2 words, but if you shift the word break by just 1 letter, you get something else entirely. You get sang-real, and sang-real in Old French means royal blood. Let that sink in. The Holy Grail is the royal blood. It's a breathtaking piece of wordplay, an esoteric pun of genius. It's the kind of subtle misdirection that secret societies have always delighted in. The quest for the Holy Grail was never about finding a piece of sacred tableware. It was a mission to find, serve, and protect the sang-real, the living, breathing bloodline of Jesus Christ. The entire legend becomes an allegory for the Templars' secret purpose. The Grail Castle, Mont Salvation, or the Mountain of Salvation, in some tales, is not a literal castle you can find on a map. It is the sanctuary, wherever it may be, that houses and protects the sacred lineage. The Fisher King, the wounded guardian of the Grail, is the current head of that lineage, suffering until the kingdom can be restored. The Grail Knights are his guardians. They are the Templars. Suddenly, the Grail itself, the vessel, is no longer a cup. The vessel that held the blood of Christ was the womb of Mary Magdalene. She is the Grail. She is the chalice who carried the future of the dynasty within her. This reinterpretation doesn't just change the story. It elevates Mary Magdalene from the maligned and misunderstood figure of church propaganda into her true role, the Grail Queen, the holy vessel, the co-founder of a sacred legacy. It's a powerful echo of the Gnostic reverence for Sophia, the divine feminine wisdom. a concept we know was anathema to the patriarchal structure of the Roman Church. It's the ultimate medieval word puzzle. Knights were sent on a fool's errand searching for a cup, while the real secret, the bloodline, was being guarded right under their noses. To understand the Queen, you have to discard the image of her created by the Church. The idea of Mary Magdalene as a repentant prostitute is not supported by the Bible. It was the result of a sermon given by Pope Gregory the Great in 591 AD, in which he conflated several different women from the Gospels, including the unnamed sinner who anoints Jesus' feet, into the single figure of Mary Magdalene. The Gnostic Gospels, those texts that were suppressed by the Orthodox Church but rediscovered in 1945 at Nag Hammadi, paint a very different picture. In the Gospel of Philip, Mary Magdalene is called Jesus' koinonos, a Greek word that means companion or consort, a partner. It says that Jesus loved her more than all the other disciples, and he used to kiss her often on her mouth. In the Gospel of Mary, she is portrayed as the apostle to whom Jesus entrusted his most profound and secret teachings, the Gnosis, which infuriated the male disciples like Peter, who couldn't accept a woman being given precedence over them. This is the woman of the Sangreal theory, a woman of power, wisdom, and high standing. After the crucifixion, as a key leader of the Jesus movement and the carrier of his child, her life would have been in mortal danger. The legend, which is particularly strong in the south of France, says she fled Judea by boat, landing on the shores of Provence at a place now called Saintes Maries de la Mer, the Saint Marys of the Sea. And she was not alone. She was accompanied by a child, a daughter named Sarah. In Hebrew, the name Sarah means princess. This is the root of the vine. In the fertile, independent, and mystically inclined culture of the Languedoc, the bloodline took hold. It intermarried with the local Visigothic nobility and, later, with the rising power of the Franks, eventually flowing directly into the veins of the Merovingian kings. This is why the Merovingians, as we touched on before, were seen as so different. Their legend of being descended from a sea beast was a garbled, mythic memory of their true origin, an ancestor who came from across the sea, carrying a sacred, semi-divine heritage. The Sangreal, this hidden history, this cult of the Magdalene and the sacred bloodline, thrived in the south of France. It's no coincidence that this same region was the heartland of the Cathars and a major center of Templar power. One of the more fascinating and fringe pieces of evidence for this hidden tradition is the phenomenon of the Black Madonnas. All across southern France, in churches often built on former Templar or pagan sites, you find these strange, enigmatic statues of a dark-skinned Virgin Mary holding a dark-skinned child. For proponents of the bloodline theory, these are not representations of the biblical Mary. They are coded symbols of the other Mary, the exiled queen, Mary Magdalene, and her child, Sarah. They represent the shadow lineage, the black or hidden truth that existed alongside the white or public truth of the Roman Church. So, if the Grail is a bloodline, and Mary Magdalene is its queen, then the Templars become its Praetorian Guard. Their entire existence was a creation of the noble families who were the custodians of this secret, families from Champagne, Burgundy, and the Languedoc, to find the physical proof in Jerusalem and then establish a permanent, powerful organization to protect the living descendants. The connection between the Templars and the Grail while not explicit, is powerfully suggested in the literature itself. The connection between the Templars and the Cistercian order is a known historical fact. And the Cistercians, under Bernard of Clairvaux, were great promoters of the cult of the Virgin Mary. It is within this Cistercian Templar milieu that the Grail romances flourish. The most detailed and esoteric of all the Grail stories is the German romance Parzival, by Wolfram von Eschenbach, written in the early 13th century. In his version, the knights who guard the Grail castle of Montsalvage are called the Tempelisten. It doesn't take much imagination to see the connection to the German Tempelherren, or Knights Templar. Wolfram's Grail is not a cup but a stone, the lapis exilis, which fell from heaven and has miraculous powers, a symbol, perhaps, of the sacred knowledge the Templars protected. He makes a tantalizing claim that he got the true story not from Chrétien de Troyes, but from a man in Provence named Caillot, who in turn discovered the original story in a manuscript written in Arabic in the city of Toledo, Spain, a place renowned as a crossroads of Christian, Jewish, and Islamic knowledge and a center for translating esoteric texts. This claim deliberately roots the Grail legend away from Rome and through a channel of alternative, secret wisdom. Of course, the connection between the Templars and the Grail romances is a subject of intense scholarly debate. Many mainstream historians see only circumstantial evidence and argue that the knightly ideals of the time were simply projected onto the fictional Grail keepers. But for those who look for the hidden patterns, the connections are too strong to ignore. The Templars fit the profile of the Grail Knights perfectly. A celibate, elite, spiritual military order dedicated to a secret purpose, operating from a mysterious fortress, and possessing a secret that gives them their power. Imagine being a high-ranking member of that order. Your life is a constant performance. To the public, you are a pious warrior monk. But in the secret chapter meetings, you are reminded of your true vow, to guard the living Grail. No, Your Grace, I'm afraid you can't attend the tournament at Lyon. It's too risky. We have an entire sacred dynasty to think about here. By redefining the Grail, you redefine the Templars' entire mission and the reason for their fall. They weren't destroyed for their gold. They were destroyed because their secret, the Sangreal, represented a fundamental threat to the two pillars of medieval power, the divine right of kings, which was granted by the Church, and the divine authority of the Pope, which was granted by God. A living bloodline of Christ would have a claim that superseded both. It was a secret that had to be extinguished. King Philip and Pope Clement didn't just want their money. They wanted to destroy the very idea they were protecting. And so, their desperate flight into the unknown after 1307 becomes something far more profound. It is not just a flight of refugees. It is the Grail itself, in peril, being moved to a new, secret castle. The ships disappearing from La Rochelle were not just fleeing. They were undertaking the next stage of the quest. They were carrying the royal blood, the Sangreal, to a new sanctuary, beyond the reach of its mortal enemies. The quest was not over. It was just beginning a new chapter, in a new, wilder land, under a different sky. The salt spray of the Atlantic bites at your face. Behind you, the continent of Europe, with its grasping kings and compromised popes, fades into memory. Before you, through the swirling gray mist, a rugged coastline appears, a land of dark mountains, deep locks, and defiant castles. You are sailing into the one kingdom that has become a refuge by virtue of its rebellion. You are sailing for Scotland. In the early 14th century, Scotland was the perfect sanctuary for a fugitive order like the Templars. It was a kingdom at war, fighting for its very existence against the mighty English army of King Edward II. Its king, the legendary Robert the Bruce, was a pariah in the eyes of the church. In 1306, in his bid for the crown, he had murdered his chief rival, John Comyn, on the holy ground of a church altar in Dumfries. For this act of sacrilege, the Pope had excommunicated him. This was a devastating blow for a medieval monarch, cutting him off from the community of Christendom. But for the fugitive Templars, Bruce's excommunication was a godsend. It meant that the papal bull dissolving their order, the decree that was being enforced with fire and sword in France, had no legal power in Scotland. An excommunicated king was not bound to obey the Pope's commands. For the Templars, Scotland was a legal and spiritual safe zone. The political calculus was brutally simple. Scotland's great enemy, England, was ruled by King Edward II. Edward's wife was Isabella, the daughter of the Templars' great nemesis, King Philip IV of France. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Robert the Bruce desperately needed elite, experienced, battle-hardened soldiers to bolster his vastly outnumbered forces. The Templars were the most formidable fighting force of their age, and they desperately needed a safe harbor where they could land their ships, regroup, and continue their mission, far from the reach of Philip and his puppet Pope. It was a match made in geopolitical heaven. This wasn't a blind leap into the unknown, either. The Templars had a long and established presence in Scotland. Their Scottish headquarters was at Ballintroduch, an estate just south of modern-day Edinburgh, in a place now simply called Temple. They owned lands and farms across the country. They knew the terrain. They knew the political players. They had existing infrastructure. They weren't arriving as strangers. They were coming home to their most remote and now safest commandery. The most dramatic, though historically contentious, story of their arrival centers on the single most important battle in Scottish history, the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Robert the Bruce, with a Scottish army of perhaps 6,000 men, faced an invading English force 3 times its size. On the first day of battle, the Scots, through clever use of terrain and sheer ferocity, held their own and inflicted serious damage on the overconfident English knights. But the main English army was still intact and overwhelming. On the second day, the battle hung in the balance. The Scottish schiltrons, tight formations of spearmen, were holding back the charges of the English heavy cavalry, but they were under immense pressure. At the critical moment, as the English lines were wavering but not yet broken, a new force appeared on the ridge overlooking the battlefield. They were a disciplined body of horsemen, well-equipped and flying unfamiliar banners. The English, exhausted and already demoralized, saw this new contingent and panicked, believing it to be a fresh Scottish relief force. The panic turned into a rout. The English lines shattered, and the Scots won a stunning, nation-defining victory. Official Scottish histories often explain this mysterious force as the small folk, the servants, cooks, and other camp followers who, seeing a chance at victory, grabbed makeshift weapons and charged. But the idea of a disorganized mob of civilians breaking a professional army of knights seems, to many, utterly implausible. The more tantalizing theory, the one whispered in the lore of secret societies for centuries, is that this was no mob. This was the Knights Templar, a contingent of knights who had fled France, integrated into Bruce's army in secret, and were held back as a strategic reserve, unleashed at the perfect moment to deliver the final, decisive blow. To the English, their black and white Beauseant banner might have been unrecognizable, just another terrifying omen in a battle that had gone disastrously wrong. Imagine being an English foot soldier, bogged down in the mud, seeing your knights struggling, and then you look up and see them. A silent, disciplined line of the most feared warriors in Christendom, cresting the hill and beginning their charge. It's no wonder they broke and ran. According to legend, a grateful Robert the Bruce honored these knights after the battle. Knowing the Templar order was officially dissolved, he supposedly created a new, secret order of chivalry to give them a home and preserve their traditions. This is said to be the origin of the Royal Order of Scotland, an esoteric body whose rituals and degrees are claimed to be a direct continuation of the Templar inner circle, a way for the knights to disappear into a new Scottish institution, their secrets safe under the protection of the newly victorious king. But hiding in plain sight and helping win a battle was only the first step. The Templars' true mission, as we have established, was the preservation of the Grail, the Sangreal. To do this, they couldn't remain a separate, foreign entity. They had to weave themselves, and more importantly the bloodline they protected, into the very fabric of their new home. They needed a blood pact. This is where the story moves from the battlefield into the halls of Scottish castles. The fugitive knights, stripped of their white mantles but not their noble blood or their considerable portable wealth, began to integrate. They married, and they married well. They forged alliances with the powerful Scottish noble families who had been loyal to Bruce, families who were also independent-minded and wary of foreign authority. Names like Seaton, Keith, and most famously, Sinclair, are forever linked in these legends to the Templar refugees. The theory posits that the Templars brought not just themselves, but key members of the sacred lineage they guarded, from the continent to Scotland. Their primary objective now was to ensure the survival and protection of this blood. The most logical and effective way to do this was to merge it with the royal and noble blood of Scotland. Through a series of strategic marriages, the Sangreal was grafted onto the Scottish family tree. A Templar knight of high standing, or even a male descendant of the sacred lineage, would marry the daughter of a powerful Scottish laird. A female descendant of the line would be married to a Scottish earl. This would provide the bloodline with a new identity, a new set of powerful protectors, and a new legitimacy within the defiant kingdom. The secret was now hidden in the safest place imaginable, within the veins of the Scottish aristocracy. It's the ultimate survival plan. Your secret lineage is much less likely to be hunted down when its great-grandfather is the Earl of Orkney and a signatory of the Declaration of Arbroath. The extent of Templar survival and integration into Scotland after 1312 is fiercely debated by historians. Mainstream scholarship points to the scarcity of direct, unambiguous records. There are no documents that say, on this day, Sir Jean de Valois, fugitive Knight Templar, married Lady Agnes of Clan MacLeod. Such a record would have been suicidal to create, but the proponents of the theory point to the explosion of circumstantial evidence, the legends, the folklore, and most intriguingly, the clues left in stone and symbol. The most famous of these is Rosslyn Chapel, It sits just a few miles from the old Templar headquarters at Ballantrae. Built in the mid-15th century by William Sinclair, whose ancestor was a signatory of the letter to the Pope defending the Templars, the chapel is an architectural anomaly. It is covered inside and out with a riot of carvings that are deeply strange and have no place in a conventional Christian church. There are hundreds of green men, pagan symbols of fertility and rebirth. There are carvings of corn and aloe vera, plants that were supposedly unknown in Europe before Christopher Columbus's voyages to the Americas nearly half a century later, suggesting the Sinclairs had access to secret knowledge of other lands, perhaps from tales brought back by the Templar fleet. The whole building feels less like a church and more like a library of stone, a textbook of suppressed knowledge, from Gnosticism to Celtic paganism to Templar symbolism. It is, for many, the ultimate Grail castle, a monument to the fusion of Templar secrets and Scottish nobility. Rosslyn is a conspiracy theorist's paradise. Every pillar and ceiling boss seems to whisper a new secret, hinting at a history far deeper and more complex than the one we read in books. And then there is the evidence in heraldry, the symbolic language of the nobility. Certain Scottish families with legendary Templar connections began to incorporate strange symbols into their coats of arms. One of these, as specified in our journey tonight, is the double-headed eagle. This is an ancient and powerful symbol used by empires from the Hittites to Byzantium to the Holy Roman Empire. On one level, it represents a ruler's dominion over both East and West. But in esoteric traditions, it has a deeper meaning. It is a symbol of gnosis, of enlightenment. It represents the union of opposites, the temporal and the spiritual, the male and the female, the conscious and the unconscious. It is the symbol of the perfected soul. For the descendants of the Sangreal and their Templar guardians, it would be the perfect symbol of their mission, the unification of the human and the divine in a single bloodline. Its appearance in Scottish heraldry is seen as a quiet, coded announcement of who they were and what they protected. So, Scotland became the new crucible. It was the safe harbor where the three key elements of our story converged and were forged into something new. The fugitive but still wealthy and organized Templar Brotherhood, the sacred bloodline of the Sangreal they carried with them, and the defiant, newly independent Scottish nobility, led by a king who owed them his throne. The Templars didn't just fade into the mists of Scottish history. They assimilated, intermarried, and embedded their secret into the very heart of the nation. Their mission was no longer carried out by a public order in white mantles, but through the quieter, more enduring channels of family, blood, and shared secrets. From this new Grail castle in the cold, northern wild, they were now positioned to begin the next, most ambitious phase of their plan. Not just to protect the idea of divine kingship, but to actively shape and control it throughout all of Europe. You have now followed the Grail, the living bloodline, to its new sanctuary in the misty glens of Scotland. You've seen it sheltered by an excommunicated king and integrated into the defiant nobility of a nation forged in rebellion. But a secret of this magnitude, a truth with the power to rewrite history, cannot simply remain hidden. A seed that potent is not meant to lie dormant. Its purpose is to grow, to spread, to eventually reshape the entire landscape. The third act of the Templar plan was not one of survival, but of influence. From their new, shadowy base of operations, They set out to achieve their most audacious goal yet, not merely to serve kings, but to fundamentally redefine the very nature of kingship itself. They sought to shape the throne of God on earth according to their own secret doctrine. To understand how revolutionary their project was, you must first understand the prevailing model of power in medieval Europe. The concept was known as the divine right of kings. A king, it was believed, ruled by the will of God. But, and this is the crucial part, that divine right was not automatic. It was conferred upon him by an earthly authority, the church. The key moment in any king's life was his coronation. It was here that a bishop, an archbishop, or sometimes the pope himself, would anoint the new monarch with holy oil in a ceremony that mirrored the anointing of the ancient kings of Israel. This act of anointing was what made the king sacred. It was the church that acted as the conduit, the channel through which God's grace flowed to the ruler. This model gave the papacy in Rome immense leverage over every throne in Christendom. The church was the gatekeeper of legitimacy. If a king displeased the pope, he could be threatened with excommunication, a spiritual decree that could have devastating temporal consequences. As we saw with Robert the Bruce, it could theoretically invalidate his rule and release his subjects from their oaths of fealty. It was the ultimate trump card. The power struggle between King Philip IV and Pope Boniface VIII, which led to the Templars' destruction, was fundamentally a fight over this principle. Philip was fighting for the sovereignty of his crown against papal interference, but even he was operating within this traditional framework. He simply wanted to be the master of the church in his own kingdom. The Templars, or rather the secret society that carried their mission forward, proposed a far more radical, far more heretical idea. They championed a different model of divine right, one that cut the church out of the equation entirely. In their doctrine, a monarch's right to rule was not conferred by a ceremony. It was not granted by a priest anointing him with oil. It was inherent. It was in his blood. This is the ultimate political implication of the sangreal. If a king or queen is a direct descendant of the physical bloodline of Jesus Christ, then they are born sacred. Their divinity is a biological fact, a genealogical inheritance. They don't need a bishop to make them holy. They are holy. Their claim to the throne comes directly from the blood in their veins, a claim that is more ancient, more direct, and arguably more legitimate than that of the Pope in Rome, whose authority rests on a spiritual succession from St. Peter. This ideology transforms a king from a servant of the church into its rival, or even its master. It creates an absolute monarch in the truest sense of the word, one whose authority is unshakable and requires no external validation. The secret mission, post-1314, became the propagation of this idea. The hidden Templar network, now woven into the fabric of Scottish nobility, would seek to identify, support, and advise European rulers who had a plausible claim, or could be given one, to this sacred heritage. They would act as silent kingmakers, funding and guiding monarchs who were sympathetic to their goal of creating a new world order based not on Roman orthodoxy, but on their own Gnostic truth of a holy bloodline. And their primary case study, the political vehicle for this ideology, was the royal house of their new home, the Stuart dynasty of Scotland. The theory we are following suggests that the sangreal, which was first merged with the families of Bruce and Sinclair, eventually flowed through strategic marriages into the main Scottish royal line, culminating in the House of Stuart. and the Stuarts became the most passionate and ultimately tragic champions of the absolute divine right of kings that Europe had ever seen. Kings like James VI of Scotland, who in 1603 would unite the crowns and become King James I of England, were not just politicians, they were political theorists. James wrote extensively on the divine right of kings, arguing in works like The True Law of Free Monarchies that a king is chosen by God and answers to God alone, not to his people, not to Parliament, and certainly not to the Pope. To his opponents, this was seen as insufferable arrogance. But if you view it through the lens of the Templar secret, James wasn't just being a tyrant. He may have genuinely believed it because he was the secret custodian of a lineage that, in his mind, proved it. His stubborn belief in his own divine status wasn't just a political convenience. It was a deeply held family secret, a truth whispered to him by the guardians of the tradition that now surrounded his throne. And what was this network that surrounded the Stuart court? Here we find the next evolution of the Templar order, the rise of Freemasonry. This is another fringe tidbit, but a critical one to the theory. The origins of modern Freemasonry are murky, but one of the most persistent foundation myths, particularly strong in Scottish Rite Masonry, is that it was created from the remnants of the Knights Templar who found refuge in Scotland. The rituals, the secret degrees of initiation, the esoteric symbols, the focus on the building of Solomon's Temple. It's all seen as a continuation of the inner workings of the Templar order, now disguised as a fraternal guild of stonemasons. The first official records of Masonic lodges appear in Scotland in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, right in the heart of the Stuart era. The Stuarts became great patrons of the craft. When they were exiled from Britain after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, they used the network of Masonic lodges that had spread to the continent as a secret web to support their cause, the Jacobite movement, which sought to restore them to the throne. Freemasonry, in this view, was the new public face of the hidden Templar mission, and the Stuarts were their chosen royal line. Historians hotly contest these origins, with many tracing Freemasonry to more mundane medieval guilds. But the legendary connection to the Templars and the Stuarts remains a powerful part of its identity. So the Templars, now operating through this Masonic network, weren't just hiding. They were actively trying to build their ideal world. They became an invisible college, spreading their ideas not just through political maneuvering, but through the intellectual and cultural currents of the age. They influenced the rise of Renaissance humanism, the scientific revolution, and the esoteric philosophies of Rosicrucianism, all of which challenged the old, rigid authority of the Church and promoted the search for hidden knowledge. They were playing the ultimate long game, subtly changing the way Europe thought about God, about science, and about power. It's like they were the most successful and secretive political lobbying firm in history. No backroom deals, just a few centuries of patiently whispering Gnostic secrets into the ears of the right philosophers, artists, and princes. It's quite a project to manage. It's past midnight here in Ho Chi Minh City, and you have to wonder if the old Templar masters ever had to deal with the logistical nightmare of running a secret society across multiple time zones. Trying to coordinate a plot to redefine the European monarchy must be tough when your key operatives in Scotland are just waking up as your agents in Italy are going to bed. This was their grand project, to create a new world order, ruled by a new kind of king. A sacred king whose legitimacy flowed from his own blood, guided by a secret brotherhood of illuminated guardians. It was an attempt to finally realize the dream that had begun in the vaults beneath Jerusalem, to place a descendant of the Sangreal on a throne, and in doing so, restore what they saw as the true, hidden legacy of Christ. They didn't just want to serve royalty, they wanted to be the very source of its claim to divinity. They had nurtured the bloodline. They had merged it with one of the great royal houses of Europe. They had created a new, clandestine network to protect and promote it. They had laid the philosophical groundwork for a new understanding of power. They had done everything possible to ensure the continuation of their mission through the centuries. But this leaves us with one last, tantalizing, and profoundly modern question. If this bloodline was so carefully curated, so jealously guarded, and so central to the secret history of the Western world, is there any way to prove it? Could a trace of this sacred inheritance, this Sangreal, have survived the tumult of the centuries in a form that we could, with our own modern magic, finally detect? The answer to that may not lie in dusty archives or stone chapels, but in the very building blocks of life itself. And so, we arrive at the edge of the map. Our journey has taken us from the sun-scorched dust of Jerusalem to the smoky halls of French castles, from the pyres of Paris to the misty battlefields of Scotland, and deep into the esoteric heart of European monarchy. We have followed the whispers of a secret, the Sangreal, through centuries of history and legend. But now, our journey must take its final step, leaving the realm of historical speculation and entering our own. We have to ask the ultimate question, the one that hangs over this entire epic tale. Is there any proof? Could a secret so ancient, so carefully guarded, so world-shaking, leave a tangible trace that we could find today? For 700 years, the quest to understand the Templars' true legacy has been fought in libraries, in archives, and in the speculative pages of controversial books. The evidence has always been circumstantial, a constellation of clues that you can either see as a random scattering of stars or connect into a brilliant, hidden pattern. The timing of the Grail romances, the linguistic twist of Sangreal, the sudden flight of the fleet, the enigma of Rosslyn Chapel, the rise of Freemasonry. These are all compelling data points, but they are not proof. They are echoes in the stone and whispers on the parchment. But we live in an age of new magic. We have a tool that the Templars, for all their secret knowledge, could never have dreamed of. We have the ability to read the other secret text, the one written not on scrolls but in the very cells of our bodies. The human genome. The modern quest for the Grail has moved from archaeology to genetics. The idea is breathtakingly simple and monumentally complex. If the Sangreal is a real, physical bloodline passed down through 20 centuries, then it must have left a genetic signature, a specific set of markers, a unique haplogroup on the Y chromosome or in the mitochondrial DNA that could be traced like a golden thread through the tapestry of human history. If we could find that thread, we could potentially validate the entire legend. But how on earth would you even begin? The first and most significant hurdle is the need for a baseline. To identify a specific genetic signature, you need a confirmed, authenticated source to start with. You would need the DNA of Jesus Christ. And that is a problem that borders on the impossible. The most famous relic, the Shroud of Turin, which bears the image of a crucified man, contains traces of blood. But its authenticity is one of the most contentious subjects in the world. and the ancient DNA on it is fragmented, degraded, and contaminated by centuries of handling. Other relics, splinters of the true cross, or vials of Christ's blood, are almost universally considered by historians to be pious medieval forgeries. There is no verifiable sample zero. So, what about working backwards? The field of ancient DNA analysis is real and advancing at an incredible pace. Scientists have successfully sequenced the genomes of Egyptian pharaohs from their mummified remains and medieval kings from their bones. We have the technical ability. One could, in theory, exhume the remains of Merovingian kings from their tombs in France or test the bones of Stuart monarchs interred in Westminster Abbey. You could then test the DNA of living people who claim descent, like the Sinclair family, Earls of Rosslyn. If you found a unique and consistent genetic marker that linked all these disparate individuals across 1,000 years, you would have something extraordinary. But even then, what would it prove? You would have established a remarkable noble lineage, but you could not definitively label it the Sangreal without that impossible first sample to compare it to. And then there are the ethical considerations. The ethical and practical challenges of sequencing DNA from potentially sacred remains, like those in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or from a revered object like the Shroud, create a complex debate between the hunger for scientific inquiry and the demands of religious reverence. Imagine the controversy. Scientists demand to scrape genetic material from holy relic. It's a headline that writes itself, and a firestorm that no institution would want to face. The paperwork alone to get permission to test these things, from the Vatican to various royal families to historical trusts, would be a quest more arduous than anything Percival ever faced. But let's, for a moment, engage in a thought experiment. Let's imagine we live in a world where these hurdles have been overcome. A miracle happens. A verifiable sample is found. A unique genetic marker is isolated. Let's call it the Grail marker. Scientists now have a specific sequence to look for. And at the same time, millions of people all over the world are submitting their own DNA to commercial services like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA, building a vast, searchable, global database of human genetics. The search begins. What would we find? What would happen? Perhaps the results would confirm the legend. The marker would appear in the DNA of certain Scottish families, in the descendants of French and Spanish nobility, validating the story of a carefully curated and protected bloodline. But what if the result was something far stranger, far more chaotic and beautiful? What if, when they ran the search, the Grail marker started lighting up everywhere? What if it appeared in the genome of a high school teacher in Ohio, a fisherman in the Philippines, a software engineer in Bangalore, a street artist in Sao Paulo? What if it turned out that this blood, so sacred and so secret, had, over the course of 60 generations, done what all human blood does: spread, mingled, and flowed into the great, wide ocean of the human family? Think of the beautiful irony. The Templars created an elite, secret, hierarchical organization to guard what they saw as the ultimate exclusive birthright. And yet, the very nature of human existence may have played the ultimate joke on their secrecy. A descendant of the Sangreal in the 15th century might have had a child with a commoner. That child has 2 children. They have 4, and so on. Through the exponential growth of ancestry, the royal blood would be diluted and distributed secretly and silently throughout the entire population. It would become the heritage not of a chosen few, but of a random, unsuspecting many. You might get an email one day from a genetics company. Dear customer, an update to your profile shows you are 14% Irish, 2% Ashkenazi Jewish, and 0.0001% descended from a messianic dynasty from the 1st century Levant. Have a nice day. This outcome would be the most profound and Gnostic truth of all. The divine spark isn't the exclusive property of kings. It's a potential hidden in everyone. The Templars' great secret would be that there is no secret other than the one we have forgotten. That the sacred is not separate from us, but a part of us, waiting to be recognized. The most esoteric interpretation of their mission might be that they knew this all along, that their goal was not to keep the bloodline exclusive, but to protect it long enough for it to spread so far and wide that it could never be extinguished. For now, of course, this is all just a story. We have no Grail marker. We have no confirmed DNA. The sacred bloodline remains where it has always been, in the realm of myth, faith, and tantalizing speculation. And perhaps that is where it belongs. The power of the Templar mystery, the reason it still grips our imagination so fiercely tonight, is that it lives in that shimmering space between what we know and what we wonder. It cannot be definitively proven, but neither can it be definitively disproven. It is a locked room in the castle of history, and we have no key, only the freedom to imagine what lies inside. The true legacy of the Templars, then, might not be a physical bloodline at all. It may be the story itself, a story that encourages us to believe that there is more to our history than we are told in school. It is an invitation to look for the hidden patterns, to question the official narrative, and to believe in the possibility of profound secrets still waiting to be discovered. The quest for the Holy Grail is not over. It has simply changed its form. It is the quest for knowledge, the search for truth, the endless human desire to understand who we are and where we came from. And that is a quest that belongs to all of us. And with that, our long journey through the shadows of history comes to a gentle close for tonight. The echoes of battle, the whispers of conspiracy, the weight of centuries. You can let them all begin to fade now. Let the grand theories and hidden bloodlines dissolve into the soft darkness of your room, like sugar melting in warm tea. Feel the solidness of the bed beneath you, a safe and steady anchor in the quiet of the night. The story is told, the adventure is over, and there is nothing left for you to do now but rest. Listen to the gentle, rhythmic hum of the fan, a steady, soothing mantra that washes over you, clearing your mind of all the complex threads we've woven together. Each rotation of the blades is a soft breath, pushing away the last remnants of the day, carrying away the intrigue of forgotten kings and secret nights. There are no more riddles to solve, no more symbols to decipher. There is only this moment of profound peace, this gentle descent into the deep, restorative quiet of sleep. Allow your own breathing to slow, to deepen, to fall into sync with the peaceful rhythm of the room, and feel yourself drifting effortlessly and safely into the welcoming embrace of your dreams.